Elena Parker pressed her trembling fingers against the cold surface of her phone, staring at the text message from her mother. Your father's condition is getting worse. Please come home this weekend and bring your husband. Her heart clenched. Husband. A word that should have brought her comfort. A word that should have meant safety, love, and companionship. But for her, it was nothing more than a lie she had woven in a desperate attempt to keep her family from worrying about her. She had been engaged once. Daniel Hayes, the man who had promised her forever but had left her just months before the wedding for someone else. The betrayal had shattered her, but what hurt more was how her parents had taken it. Her father, already weak from his heart condition, had collapsed upon hearing the news. Her mother, proud and dignified, had cried for the first time in front of her. So, Elena had done the unthinkable. She had lied. To keep her father from getting worse, she had told them that the wedding had taken place in secret, that she was happily married, that she had found love and stability. But now, after months of avoiding visits, after sending carefully crafted messages and excuses, they wanted to meet the man who didn't exist. She closed her eyes and inhaled sharply. She needed a husband, a temporary one. That's when the idea struck her, ridiculous, desperate, and completely insane. The cafe was quiet in the late afternoon, filled only with the soft hum of conversations and the clinking of coffee cups. Elena sat in a secluded corner, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Her friend, Sophie, slid into the seat across from her. So, let me get this straight. Sophie leaned forward, lowering her voice. You want to hire a fake husband to fool your family? Elena winced. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it is. It's crazy, Elena, Sophie hissed. This isn't some romance novel where you magically fall in love with a fake husband and live happily ever after. I know that, Elena muttered. I just need someone to pretend for a few days. Someone reliable, trustworthy, and good at keeping secrets. I'll pay them well. Sophie sighed, rubbing her temples. You do realize you're describing a professional actor? Actors are too risky. What if my family asks personal questions? Sophie groaned. Do you have anyone in mind? Elena hesitated. No. That's why I need your help. Sophie leaned back, crossing her arms. I might know someone. Elena's heart leaped. Really? Sophie frowned. He's complicated. And not exactly the type of guy you hire for something like this. Elena's stomach twisted. What do you mean? Sophie sighed. His name is Damien Carter. He works odd jobs, mostly under-the-table deals. People say he's dangerous, but I think he's just closed off. He owes me a favor, though. I can ask him. Elena bit her lip. A stranger. A dangerous one at that. But did she have any other choice? All right, she said. Set up a meeting. The next evening, Elena found herself in a dimly lit bar. The place was quiet but had an air of tension, like it wasn't meant for people like her. Sophie had already left after making the introductions, leaving her alone with Damien Carter. He sat across from her, his broad frame relaxed but alert. His dark eyes studied her with quiet amusement, as if he had already figured her out before she even spoke. So, he drawled, tapping his fingers against the wooden table. You need a husband? Elena straightened her back, trying to maintain some dignity. A temporary one. His lips twitched. Interesting request. Most women hire divorce lawyers, not fake husbands. She clenched her hands together. Are you willing to do it or not? He tilted his head, watching her for a long moment before speaking. How much are you offering? She exhaled, relieved that he was at least considering it. I can pay. I don't need money. Her mouth snapped shut. Then what do you want? His gaze darkened, something unreadable flashing in his expression. A favor, he said simply. Elena frowned. What kind of favor? You'll find out when the time comes. A shiver ran down her spine. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away. But she had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. Fine. You have a deal. Damien smirked, reaching his hand out. Then it's settled, sweetheart. You just got yourself a husband. Elena grasped his hand, sealing the deal. Little did she know, she wasn't hiring a stranger. She was inviting back a man whose life she had unknowingly saved years ago. And this time, he had no intention of letting her go. Elena wasn't sure what she had expected after making the deal with Damian Carter, but watching him lean back with a lazy smirk, as if he found the entire situation amusing, made her second-guess her decision. She took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "We need to go over the details." Damian raised an eyebrow. "Details?" "Yes," she said firmly. "If you're going to be my husband, we need a backstory. My family will ask questions. How we met, how long we've been married, things like that." He gave a slow nod, his fingers tapping against the table. "All right, sweetheart. Let's hear it. What's our grand love story?" Elena pulled out a notepad and pen, ignoring the way his lips twitched in amusement. "We met a year ago in the city. We dated for 6 months before getting married in a small ceremony." He tilted his head. "Romantic." She ignored the sarcasm. "You work in business consulting. That way, if my father asks about your job, you don't have to explain much." Damian hummed. "Not bad. But what's my favorite food?" Elena blinked. "What? If we're married, your parents will expect you to know small details. My favorite food, what side of the bed I sleep on, bad habits, pet peeves." His voice was teasing, but his gaze was sharp. She hadn't thought about that. What is your favorite food?" "Steak. Medium rare." She wrote it down. "Good. And what side of the bed?" "Left." "Bad habits?" He smirked. "I bite." She nearly dropped the pen. "Excuse me?" His eyes gleamed with mischief. "When I'm thinking, I bite my lip." She scowled, cheeks heating. "Pet peeves?" "People who ask too many questions." She shot him a glare. "You do realize that's unavoidable in this situation?" He chuckled, leaning forward. "Relax, Elena. I'll play the role. Your family won't suspect a thing." She wasn't sure if she believed him, but there was no turning back now. The next morning, Elena packed her bags and met Damian outside her apartment. He was leaning against a sleek black car, dressed casually in jeans and a fitted black shirt, but he still looked like he belonged in a high-end magazine. He opened the passenger door for her. "Ready, Mrs. Carter?" She rolled her eyes and slid into the seat. "Don't call me that." He grinned, shutting the door before walking around to the driver's side. As they pulled onto the highway, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with the devil. When they arrived at her parents' home, her mother was already waiting on the porch, eyes lighting up when she saw them. "Elena!" "Oh, my sweet girl." Her mother rushed forward, pulling her into a tight hug. Elena smiled, hugging her back. "Hi, Mom." When her mother finally pulled away, her gaze landed on Damian, and she gasped. "Oh my, aren't you handsome?" Damian flashed his most charming smile. "You must be Mrs. Parker. Elena talks about you all the time." Elena nearly choked. Her mother beamed. "Oh, what a sweetheart. Come inside, come inside. Your father is resting, but he'll be so happy to meet you." As they stepped into the house, Elena felt Damian's hand brush against her lower back. It was a subtle touch, meant to sell the illusion of a loving husband, but the warmth of it sent a shiver up her spine. She told herself it was just part of the act. But deep down, she feared it was something much more dangerous. The warmth of her childhood home should have been comforting, but Elena felt anything but relaxed. She was hyper-aware of Damian beside her, playing the role of a devoted husband with infuriating ease. Her mother couldn't stop smiling as she led them into the living room. Sit. I'll bring some tea." Damian sat down on the couch like he belonged there, his arm casually draped over the backrest. Elena hesitated before sitting beside him, stiff and uncomfortable. Her mother returned with a tray, setting it down before taking a seat across from them. She studied Damian with open curiosity. "So, tell me, Damian, how did you and Elena meet?" Elena tensed. This was the first real test. Damian didn't miss a beat. "It was in the city," he said smoothly. "I saw her sitting in a cafe, looking frustrated as she tried to decide between coffee or tea." Elena blinked. That was surprisingly accurate. Her mother chuckled. That does sound like Elena. Damien smiled, as if recalling a fond memory. I told her she should get both, but she just rolled her eyes at me. I liked her immediately. Elena turned to him, startled. That hadn't been part of the backstory they'd rehearsed. But the way he spoke, so natural and sure, made it seem real. Her mother sighed. That's so romantic. She turned to Elena, eyes twinkling. And when did you know you loved him, dear? Elena opened her mouth, but before she could think of a believable answer, Damien reached for her hand. She knew the moment I kissed her, he said. Elena's breath hitched. He was watching her, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin, his expression unreadable. Her mother giggled like a schoolgirl. Oh, you two are just lovely. Before Elena could react, her father's voice called out weakly from the hallway. Margaret, who's here? Her mother stood. It's Elena and her husband, darling. There was silence. Then slow, unsteady footsteps. Elena's father appeared, his frame thinner than she remembered, his face lined with exhaustion. But his eyes, his warm, kind eyes, lit up when he saw her. Elena. She rushed forward, hugging him carefully. Hi, Dad. He chuckled, patting her back. Let me look at you. She stepped back, trying to hold back the emotions threatening to choke her. His gaze shifted to Damien, assessing. And you must be the man who stole my daughter's heart. Damien stood, offering his hand. It's an honor to finally meet you, sir. Her father studied him for a long moment before shaking his hand. You've got a strong grip. That's good. He turned to Elena, a glint of approval in his eyes. You chose well. Guilt curled in her stomach. Damien was not the man she had chosen. But as the evening continued, she couldn't deny how effortlessly he fit into her life. He talked to her parents with ease, laughed at her father's jokes, and even helped set the table without being asked. It was almost too perfect. Later that night, as they settled into the guest room together, Elena finally turned to him. You didn't have to touch my hand earlier, she whispered. Damien smirked, unbuttoning his shirt cuffs. Of course I did. A husband would. She crossed her arms. You also didn't have to make up that cafe story. He paused, glancing at her. But that part was real. Her breath caught. What? His smirk faded, replaced by something unreadable. You don't remember, do you? Elena frowned. Remember what? He exhaled, shaking his head. Never mind. She watched him, heart pounding. There was something he wasn't telling her. And for the first time, she wondered. Who exactly had she brought into her home? Elena barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Damien's words replayed in her mind. You don't remember, do you? What was he talking about? Had they met before? She turned over in bed, careful not to disturb him. They had agreed to sleep on opposite sides, but Damien seemed perfectly at ease, one arm resting behind his head, his breathing slow and steady. She studied his face in the dim light. He was frustratingly handsome, with sharp features and an air of confidence that made people take notice. But there was something else, something familiar. Had she really met him before? Morning came too soon. When Elena entered the kitchen, her mother was already making breakfast, humming to herself. Good morning, sweetheart. Elena forced a smile. Morning. Damien walked in moments later, stretching. Smells amazing, Mrs. Parker. Her mother beamed. Sit. Breakfast is almost ready. Elena watched as Damien moved around the kitchen like he belonged there. He helped set the table again, casually stealing a piece of toast. Her parents adored him already, and that terrified her. She was about to remind herself that this was all fake when her mother suddenly asked, So, when are you two planning to have children? Elena choked on her coffee. Damien, the insufferable man, simply grinned. We haven't decided yet, but we'll get there. Her mother sighed dreamily. I can't wait to have grandchildren. Elena quickly changed the subject, but the conversation left her rattled. This was getting too real. Later that afternoon, while her father napped and her mother went out to the market, Elena finally confronted Damien. Tell me the truth, she said, crossing her arms. Have we met before? Damien studied her for a moment before answering. Yes. Her heart pounded. When? He leaned against the counter. 5 years ago. 5 years? She searched her memory, but came up blank. Where? He hesitated, then smirked. You'll figure it out eventually. Frustration burned through her. Why won't you just tell me? Because, he said, stepping closer, it's more fun this way. Her breath caught as she realized how close they were. His eyes held something unreadable, something almost vulnerable. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back. Relax, Elena. I'm not your enemy. She wasn't so sure about that. But one thing was certain, Damien Carter was hiding something, and she was going to find out what it was. Elena couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Damien was keeping something important from her. Every time she tried to recall meeting him 5 years ago, her memory remained frustratingly blank. The worst part? Her family was completely enchanted by him. The next day, her mother insisted on taking them to town to meet old family friends. Damien played the perfect husband, charming everyone with his easy smile and quick wit. Elena, you found yourself a wonderful man, Mrs. Thompson, an old neighbor, gushed. So respectful. So handsome. Elena forced a smile. Yes, I'm very lucky. Damien's lips twitched, amusement dancing in his eyes. After what felt like an eternity of small talk, they finally returned home. As soon as they were alone, Elena turned to him. Enough games, Damien. If we met before, why don't I remember? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because you didn't know it was me. Her brows furrowed. That doesn't make sense. He studied her, as if debating whether to say more. Then, with a sigh, he finally spoke. You saved my life. Elena's breath hitched. What? His gaze held hers. 5 years ago, you found me bleeding in an alley. A memory flickered. A rainy night. A shadowed figure slumped against a wall. Blood pooling on the pavement. Her stomach clenched. That was him. You. She struggled to find the words. You were that man? He nodded. You didn't ask questions. You just helped. She swallowed hard, recalling how she had rushed to find help before the man disappeared, leaving behind only a blood-stained jacket. But why didn't you tell me before? She asked. His lips curved into a small, unreadable smile. Would you have believed me? She opened her mouth to argue, but hesitated. Would she have? A shiver ran down her spine. Damien Carter wasn't just some stranger she hired to play her husband. He had been in her life before. And now, she had no idea what that truly meant. Elena's mind raced as she stared at Damien. The memory of that night 5 years ago came back in flashes, rain pouring down, the sharp scent of blood, a man barely clinging to consciousness. She had helped him. And now, he was here, playing the role of her husband. Why were you bleeding that night? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Damien held her gaze, his expression unreadable. It's a long story. I have time. A shadow passed over his face, and for the first time, she saw something vulnerable beneath his usual confidence. I was betrayed, he finally said. Someone I trusted tried to kill me. Her stomach twisted. And you never went to the police? He let out a humorless chuckle. Some betrayals can't be solved by the law. Elena swallowed hard. He wasn't telling her everything, but she could sense the weight behind his words. Why did you help me back then? Damien asked suddenly. She blinked, caught off guard. What? That night. You didn't know who I was. I could have been dangerous. Elena hesitated before answering. Because you were hurt, and you looked like you needed someone. Something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. I never forgot, he murmured. I owed you my life. Her breath hitched. Is that why you agreed to this? Pretending to be my husband. A slow smirk curved his lips, but there was something softer beneath it. That's part of it. Her heart pounded in her chest. What's the other part? Before she could ask, the front door suddenly opened, and her mother's voice rang out. Elena, dear, oh. Elena jumped back as if burned, realizing too late how close she and Damien had been standing. Her mother's eyes sparkled with amusement. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Damien, the infuriating man, simply grinned. Just a private conversation, Mrs. Parker. Her mother chuckled. Well, don't let me stop you. Young love is a beautiful thing. Elena felt her face heat as her mother walked away, humming to herself. She turned back to Damien, narrowing her eyes. You enjoy this, don't you? He leaned in slightly, his voice low. Maybe. Her breath caught. She needed to remember this was all pretend. But with every passing moment, it was getting harder to tell what was real. Elena paced the length of her room, her mind spinning. She had hired Damien to play a role, a temporary solution to a complicated problem. But every time he looked at her like that, every time his touch lingered a second too long, she felt herself slipping. This was not supposed to happen. With a frustrated sigh, she ran a hand through her hair. She needed to put some distance between them. A knock on the door made her jump. Elena? Damien's voice was calm as always. Can I come in? She hesitated before opening the door. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. Are you avoiding me? She scoffed. I'm trying to keep things professional. He smirked. Professional? We're married, remember? Her pulse quickened. Only in front of my family. Damien studied her, his gaze piercing. And when we're alone? She opened her mouth, but no words came. He stepped closer. Tell me the truth, Elena. Do you regret hiring me? She inhaled sharply. No. Surprise flickered in his eyes. But I regret not asking more questions about you, she added. I should have known who you really were. Damien's smirk faded. Would it have changed anything? She wanted to say yes. Wanted to believe that knowing their past connection would have made her think twice. But deep down, she wasn't sure. Elena, he said softly, I didn't come here to play games with you. She swallowed. Then why did you come? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. I told you, he murmured. I owed you my life. Her heart pounded. And now? His fingers brushed her jaw. Now, I don't think I want to leave. A sharp knock on the front door downstairs shattered the moment. Elena, her mother called. You have a visitor. Elena and Damien exchanged a look before she rushed downstairs. The moment she saw who was at the door, her breath caught. No. It couldn't be. Her ex-fiancé, Ryan, stood on the porch, looking as if he had seen a ghost. Elena, he breathed. I need to talk to you. Damien's presence behind her was immediate. His arms slipped around her waist, his body warm and solid against hers. Elena's busy, Damien said coolly. With her husband. Ryan's eyes darkened. Husband. Elena forced herself to stand tall. Yes. Damien and I are married. Ryan's jaw clenched. I don't believe you. Damien smirked. Then you're welcome to stay and watch, but I doubt you'll like what you see. Before Elena could react, Damien cupped her face and kissed her. A real kiss. Not for show. Not for an audience. Just them. And for the first time, Elena wasn't sure where the lie ended and the truth began. Elena's breath hitched as Damien's lips moved against hers, firm yet teasing, as if daring her to push him away. She should. Ryan was watching. Her mother was probably watching. But she couldn't move. Her fingers curled into Damien's shirt, holding onto him as the world spun around her. It was only when he pulled away, slowly, deliberately, that reality came crashing back. Ryan's face was a storm of emotions. His fists clenched at his sides, jaw tight with barely restrained anger. This is a joke, he spat. You're not married. This is just some game you're playing to get back at me. Elena's heart pounded. Believe what you want, Ryan. It doesn't change the truth. Ryan stepped closer, ignoring Damien's darkening gaze. Elena, I made a mistake. His voice was softer now, pleading. Leaving you was the biggest regret of my life. I know I hurt you, but I want to make things right. She stiffened, old wounds threatening to reopen. I still love you, he whispered. Please come back to me. Silence filled the air. Elena didn't know what to say. Then Damien chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. That's touching, he drawled. Really? But the problem is, He pulled Elena closer, his fingers resting possessively on her waist. My wife isn't interested. Ryan's gaze darkened. Stay out of this. Can't, Damien said smoothly. See, unlike you, I don't abandon the woman I love. Elena sucked in a sharp breath. Ryan's expression twisted with fury. This isn't over, Elena. He turned and stormed off without another word. The moment he was gone, Elena pulled away from Damien, her head spinning. What was that? He looked at her, completely unfazed. That was me getting rid of a problem. You. She ran a hand through her hair, exasperated. You didn't have to kiss me. His smirk was maddening. Would you rather I let him think he had a chance? She scowled. That's not the point. Damien's expression softened. Then what is the point, Elena? She opened her mouth to argue, but hesitated. What was the point? That he was blurring the lines between fake and real? That every time he touched her, she forgot this was just an act? Elena? Her mother's voice called from inside. She took a deep breath and stepped away. This conversation isn't over. Damien watched her, something unreadable in his gaze. No, he murmured. It's not. Elena avoided Damien for the rest of the day, keeping herself busy with her mother's errands. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the lingering heat of his kiss or the way her heart had pounded at his words. Unlike you, I don't abandon the woman I love. Had he meant that? Or was it just another part of the act? By the time evening fell, her mind was a mess. She stepped outside for some air, only to find Damien already on the porch, staring at the darkening sky. You've been avoiding me, he said without looking at her. Elena sighed, crossing her arms. I needed time to think. He glanced at her, his gaze unreadable. And? Have you figured it out? She hesitated. Why did you say that? Say what? She swallowed. That you don't abandon the woman you love. For the first time since she met him, Damien looked almost uncertain. Because it's true. Her heart skipped a beat. What does that mean? He let out a slow breath. I didn't just agree to this arrangement because I owed you, Elena. She stared at him, her pulse racing. I came because I wanted to, he admitted. Because he exhaled sharply. Because I've been waiting for a chance to see you again. The words sent a shiver through her. But we didn't even know each other back then, she argued. I knew enough. His voice was quiet, firm. I knew you were kind. Brave. The kind of person who helps a stranger without expecting anything in return. Elena's throat tightened. And when I found out you needed help, he continued, I couldn't walk away. She looked away, her emotions warring inside her. She had spent so long trying to convince herself that this was temporary, that Damien was just playing a part. But now he was telling her something different, something real. Tell me the truth, Elena, Damien said, stepping closer. If I asked you to let me stay, not as your fake husband, but as me, what would you say? Her breath hitched. Before she could answer, the front door opened abruptly. Elena, her mother's voice called urgently. Ryan is back. Elena's stomach dropped. Damien's expression darkened instantly. A moment later, Ryan stormed onto the porch, his face set with determination. I'm not leaving without you, he said. Not this time. And just like that, everything shattered. Elena's breath caught as Ryan's words hung heavy in the air. She looked at him, really looked at him. The man she had once loved. The man who had walked away from her when she needed him the most. Now he was back, demanding a second chance. But could she trust him? Damien stood beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. He said nothing, but she felt the tension radiating from him, his fists clenched at his sides. Elena, Ryan said, stepping closer. I made a mistake leaving you, but I've realized I can't live without you. She swallowed hard. Where was this regret when he had chosen someone else? Damien's voice was low, almost deadly. You don't get to say that now. Ryan's jaw tightened. Stay out of this. Damien took a step forward, his expression cold. She's my wife. Ryan glared. No, she's not. This marriage is a lie, isn't it, Elena? Her breath hitched. This was it. The moment the truth had to come out. Ryan looked at her with pleading eyes. Tell me it's not real. Damien, on the other hand, didn't plead. He simply waited, watching her with an intensity that sent her heart racing. No pressure. No demands. Just a silent question. What do you want? Elena closed her eyes for a moment, then took a deep breath. And when she looked up, she knew her answer. I did ask Damien to pretend to be my husband, she admitted. Ryan's face lit up with hope. But, she continued, her voice steady. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being pretend. Ryan's expression twisted. Elena. She shook her head. I loved you once, Ryan. And maybe part of me never stopped wanting closure. But I know now. I deserve more than a man who only realizes my worth after losing me. Ryan's shoulders sagged. You don't mean that. I do. Damien exhaled slowly beside her, but he said nothing. Ryan swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between them. Then, with a bitter nod, he turned and walked away. The moment he disappeared into the night, Elena felt an unexpected sense of relief. She turned to Damien. You didn't say anything. His lips quirked up in a small smile. I didn't need to. A lump formed in her throat. What if I had chosen him? He exhaled softly. Then I would have let you go. Her heart clenched. But he didn't have to. Because standing here, looking at him now, she knew she had already made her choice. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Damien. He stilled, as if bracing for what she would say next. And then she smiled. A real, unguarded smile. Stay. Damien's breath caught. His fingers tightened around hers. Always, he murmured. And just like that, the lie they had built between them faded, replaced by something real.